And that I'm introducing Gordon today is not a sign of how far I've traveled up, but I think of how Gordon himself keeps coming down to where he belongs and relating with the people and the experiences that he's working with. So I'll do the decolonial thing of asking Prof. Gordon to introduce himself, talk about his work, and then get us through the lecture that we are waiting for tonight. And Prof, one favor that I'll ask for, can you tell us today the meaning of the name Ara in your name? Because it's always El Ara Gordon. We know you are Louis, but where does the Ara come from? And thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, before I speak, which is a contradiction since I've said something, we must begin with the moment we cease to listen to the drums, we're in some deep trouble. Yes. I begin that way for a variety of reasons, and one of them is to remind us that it's important not only to listen but to hear. And as we know, in our soul and our heart beats the rhythms by which we live, and the point at which that disappears, so will life. The R stands for Ricardo. But you know, it's funny when you hear those names. That's a Spanish name, Ricardo, but its origin is in the word rex. So, sorry to be a bit pompous, but it means king. However, if you hear that, you know, there are things that you won't realize, because the word rex has its origin. Many people, when they hear words that are connected to European languages, they presume that that's the origin. But European languages are actually quite recent, unless you want to go back to Neanderthals, and that's a whole other matter. But the word rex actually comes from the word reka, which is in ancient African language, metuneta. And it's rather interesting because it's the foundation word for the words like regal, words like regale, and also words that are connected to a form of knowledge, okay? And this is something very important to know, because you see, we talk about knowledge a lot, but paradoxically, we talk about knowledge in a very unknowledgeable way. And so if we begin to think about it, we need to open ourselves to ways of connecting, to talking and thinking. So, the first thing, I'm going to do two things first. Two things, okay? The first thing, you all already know. Everybody here knows, at least who have seen me speak, that I never speak with my shoes on, okay? And there are many explanations, but the fundamental one, at least to bear in mind right now, is that on this continent there was a very ancient, a very old idea, but a very important one, which is that when you're to speak, especially when you speak to a community, it's never only the community in front of you, but it's the community that precedes you. And those are called the ancestors. And implicit in being an ancestor is the idea of a descendant. So if we are descendants, if we take on the responsibility of ancestors, then there are people, there are ideas, there are forms of life that would succeed us. And the understanding of speaking before ancestors was that as an act of respect, you take your shoes off. You take your shoes off and you put your feet to the ground. And of course, when you put your feet to the ground, particularly on this continent, there's a lot involved in that act because you are also connecting with Mother Earth. And I say Mother Earth intentionally because you know the word Africa. Many people in Africa don't even know where the word Africa comes from. But it comes from the same language from which I talked about Reka or Rek. And that is a language, an ancient language called Metu-Neter, thousands and thousands of years old. And in it, Africa means to come from the Ka. And many of you may say, okay, but what is a Ka? Well, Ka has many meanings. It means life, life force, but it also means womb. And the idea is you have come down from the womb, and the understanding of Africa is to be the place from which you have come. So for many ancient people, at least in Northeast Africa, because you have to remember, in ancient Northeast Africa, and not just there, in ancient, what we call today Europe, the idea was you look up to Africa. In other words, a lot of what we today imagine when we think we're down here is a mistake. We're up here. And if we were to look at those ancient maps, we'll discover, for instance, we'd have to turn them upside down to recognize them. Because ultimately, this place is up. Now, I'm going to give you a little exercise. Since this is about liberations, so let's start with a little practice of liberation. Okay? Okay? I just did that. What did I do? And at the moment, many of you may not know other than I tapped over and over, but I tapped 2 bars of 7. 7. You got it? Now the thing about tapping with 7 is I did that on purpose because you see when I did the 6-8 pattern, right? Unfortunately, you have inherited a world that makes you think if you think this way, that you're doing something wrong. And they say if you want to be properly scientific, you must. It's weird, isn't it? Some of you try to break out of it by even getting a little funky in 4/4. And people are like, no. You gotta do it proper. And when you hear those patterns, of course, a stereotype emerges because you see, you think of that as European. You think of that as white. But I got to tell you all, the people who became what we call white people, once upon a time knew how to groove. They knew how to shake those hips. And they used to move according to different rhythms, different ways of moving through the world. So what on earth created a kind of authenticity that make you think of. So if we go back to the 7, I'd like you to start with that. Start with this 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You know, there are many ways to count to 7, aren't there? For instance, you could count to 7 in 4s and 3s. Did you hear that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. You could also count to 7, 5, and 2. I don't normally talk sitting down, so I'll stand up eventually, but I need the table. Okay? Or you could also count 6 and 1. Now what's striking is if you look at my hand objectively, my hand seems to be doing the same thing. But each time you counted, most, if not all of you, heard something different. And this should offer an insight, because the world may be handed to us in many ways, but a lot of how we live the world depends on what we bring to it. And what we bring to it could make all the difference between or but we could add to it and many other things. I begin with that insight because, you see, when we talk about liberation and liberations, and I notice the title added in plural, it's a hint to let us know that perspectives count. You see? It's not a matter of simply taking the world as is, but we also have to understand that we have the ability, the capacity to bring something to the world. So, the first thing to bear in mind, now I can stand up, is that if you eliminate the idea of the fidelity of ancestors, because you see, ancestors, when we talk about stuff, particularly in science, when we talk about it in philosophy, all of these areas of thought, we fail to understand that it doesn't mean anything without responsibility and accountability. And one of the things about ancestors is that ancestors are not simply a question about a group of people who kind of look at you and like, yo, what you doing? But you see, it's the whole constellation of life that comes into the world of evidentiality. When we begin to think and we begin to do things, this responsibility is paradoxical because, you see, ancestors, well, they're dead. And if we take an attitude that ancestors are simply dead, then we take the position that when we die, the future doesn't matter. So if we give up on the idea of what's involved in a relationship of an ancestor and descendants, then in effect, there is no hope for life on our planet. And we're in a scary moment right now because there's a set of people running our planet right now who don't care about descendants, which means they have no interest in being ancestors, which means even their own children they're going to throw under the bus. So as we're busy trying to say, look at what they're doing to our planet, what we fail to understand is they don't give a damn. And this is where our error comes in. Because we make the mistake of thinking often that it's about persuading them. And this is one of the things I want to talk about with you tonight. Because you see, we take on a whole bunch of ways of talking about things that trap us in the world in which we live. And we don't seem to think about alternatives. It's as if we just simply think that it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we use a lot of terms in ways that we don't stop for a moment and question, what are we saying when we use these terms? A good example is that we often bring to these terms the grammar of our own subordination. You know, Drusilla Cornell this morning was rather moved and appropriately angry. And by the way, there's a whole lot of stuff out there that talks to you against anger. You know, especially if you're black. Why are you so angry? Okay? But you know, anger is a good thing when there's something appropriately to be angry about. And the very idea, what Drusilla was angry about this morning, is the presupposition that predominantly white universities should be places of research and thinking, and black ones should just be places that are subordinate, and they should just be places where people receive that information. In a way that mirrors a mantra of the colonial world. The mantra of the colonial world we have inherited, in a nutshell, is that Europeans / whites, I say slash because as I speak, you're going to see that I'm going to decouple European from white. European and white are not necessarily the same thing, okay? But the presupposition is that what is white and European, though that's the area of thought, of thinking. And you know what's left for the rest? Experience. You're supposed to just experience while others think. But the problem with that model is that that's an affirmation of a colonial relationship. Because if you think about it, sometimes we philosophers do puns. If you think about it, everyone in this room, you know you've had that experience of trying to figure out your experience. You know what I'm talking about? You're at the club. And you go in there, you walk in, you're cool, and people come up to you and they talk, but there are these times when you think you're macking and you're cool, and something weird goes down. And when something weird goes down, what do? You go and you find somebody, you said, something weird just went down. I'm not sure what it is, but I need to figure it out. And at that moment, as you try to figure out, you know what you're doing? Although you have your experience, you're trying to bring something to your experience that brings meaning and interpretation and theory to your experience. And here is the problem. You see, if that's what people do, if you only look at the theory that's brought to experience to be the theory from a very specific and exclusive group of people, then what you end up doing, and people talked about it today, people talked about, for instance, the saints of theory, such as Foucault, Derrida, Marx, Descartes, etc. They speak about them as if their constellation of experiences are the only experiences through which theory can be legitimately brought. So in effect, although you're trying to focus on experience, what you end up doing is in effect saying another set of experiences are more legitimate than your own. And so the best way out of that is to take responsibility for theory and bring that and be in a conversation with the understanding of experience. Now, there are a lot of things. What I'm going to do is just mention a few things that I think may be useful in such an enterprise. Because you see, as we talk about these things, there are things that we often don't pay attention to. One of them is we have a very strange way. I listen to a lot of talks, particularly in South Africa, but it's all over the world, but there's a strange way that a lot of theory is talked about in this country and now in South America, and I've been trying to battle this in North America. And the way that theory is talked about is as if theory as an asymmetrical, one-way construction of reality. Okay? In other words, to translate that, if colonialism occurs, it's as if the colonizers control everything, and the colonizers are just simply an effect of that everything. And I'm going to just start and say straight up to you that that is bunk. And in fact, if you look at the history of many words, I even started when I talked about my name. Because even though my name, my middle name, Ricardo, may at first be looked at as a European name, you notice that I was able to show its history, its genealogy in the continent of Africa. And that should tell you something. Because, too often we have a tendency when we try to think about the past, to think about the past as if the past began exclusively in the northern side of the Mediterranean. And that's pretty weird. Because think about it. Here we are in Africa. You know how long people have been down here? Our species evolved here, about 220,000 years. And so the idea that we're going to build our understanding of reality on roughly about 3,000 years gets weird, because what the hell were we doing for the other 217,000 years? All right, let's go to Africa. What are they doing in Africa?
But we start with the Babylonians, before Europeans.
But even Babylonians are pretty new.
Yeah.
It's as if in Africa people are like, I can't talk, I'm African. That's weird, isn't it? It's as if, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? And then you go through all this time until finally you put your toe off the continent of Africa and you suddenly say, now I can speak. Thank God that's over. I have language, I have ideas, I have thought. But that's weird. That's just absolutely weird. And so we don't have time tonight to get into the entire history of this. But one of the things I'd like you to know is that there are several concepts I'd like you to rethink. And I'm hoping your thinking of those concepts could change at least how you approach these issues, including how you talk about concepts like decoloniality today. Okay? The first concept is theory. The word theory actually is often pitted against myth. But theory, any of you all know what the word theory means? I know people talk about it a lot. In fact, we're at a point right now where people think they're very cool if they say, I do theory. And in fact, when people are embarrassed about what they do, they cloak it in a new language. They add the word critical before it. Well, I do critical theory. But the word theory is a conjunction of two words. One is Greek, thea, and thea from deus means God, but it also means to see, to view. But the other part, aurea, is rather interesting. Because you see, the thea part is the foundation not only of the word to view, but the word theater. And if you go to a theater, what you learn is that you enter and there's a skena, the stage, and you wait for the lights to come on. And if you go and you go to see, to view, the thea, which is linked to God, the old idea was if you could see what God sees, man, that would be something, wouldn't it? Man, could you imagine if you could see what God sees? People come to you, what do you see? Yo, man, I see what God sees. Well, what does God see? And you know what the answer is? Everything. Okay? However, if you're a human being, you're not a God. And so for you to see, something has to happen. And what has to happen is connected to an ancient word. In Hebrew, it's or. But it's related to the word aura. In other words, it has to be lit up. So implicit in every act of seeing what is lit up is also a decision about what you see. And that decision about what you see puts you in another ancient word. It's called crisis. And a crisis is from the word krinein, which means to decide, to choose. So in every act of seeing, there's a responsibility for what you see. And sometimes, as you know, you see some scary shit. And so if you're afraid of what you see, you have the issue of whether you're going to take responsibility for what you've seen. But here's the crucial thing. Aurea has its origins in East Africa. And so already, if we deal with the colonial paradigms, the moment we start with a Greek word, we presuppose that the whole story has to be Greek. But once you realize it's a conjunction of an African and a Greek word, that should tell you something. What it should tell you is that perhaps the ancient world was very different than what many of you think. Perhaps the ancient world was one of people interacting, connecting, and building ideas. Okay? And if you understand that, you begin to understand that this ability to see and to think is something that was shared and understood, but something happened to our understanding, our history of those abilities. And so, first of all, the thing to understand is a lot of the ancient world was not these neat divides of white, black, and all of that. Those are projections on the past. The ancient world was a world in which people were pretty much a lot like what people tend to do which is people are always trying to find out about each other. And not just there, but all the way through to the world in which many of us study today as the Euro-modern world. Okay? But if you go and look at paintings, for instance, of Genoese society, of Portuguese society, just an everyday typical scene, what may shock you is that you'll see pictures of what in today's language would be a multiracial community. And that means then that a lot of what people tell you about stuff racially and in many other forms are actually a misrepresentation of the past. And if that is correct, and it is, it means that what we are talking about are ideas that came into being, which means that they could be transformed and go out of being. So, the first concept I want to talk about, because I've heard it bandied about a lot, is the concept of modern. Folks have been saying the word modern, but they've been doing the same thing to modern that they've been doing to theory. And what that is that the word modern is being treated in a very simple way to mean to be European and to be white. And if that's what modern really means, then there's only one thing you could do if you want to be modern. So I'm sorry, black folks in the room. You got to become white. You got to get your white on. However, the word modern is from the word modo. Like mode, it means to be in fashion, it means to be present. And some people mistakenly think that because that formulation was in the 19th century, that it must be a European concept. The problem with that is, we call people like René Descartes from the 17th century modern. We call people such as Leibniz from Germany modern. And these people, that means we retroactively go back and call them modern. So clearly modern has nothing to do with the 19th century. So what the hell is modern? Well, most of the time people talk about modern, they don't explain what it is. Okay? And I want to say something quickly about explanation. Because you may notice when I tapped and when I talked about theory, I talked about it in a way that may be very different from the way you're used to hearing people talk about it. And that's because, you see, theory has been handed down to us as something we oppose to myth. But myth is from the word mythos, which means from the mouth. It means it must be told. And since it must be told, it is experienced also as a retelling. Our species produces meaning from the mouth, and we repeat it even in the forms of writing, ultimately coming back to the mouth. But the tricky thing about myth is that every myth, because it has to be retold, has a myth beneath the myth. It's a very odd thing, isn't it? And when you look at the myth beneath the myth, to bring the myth out, you know what you need? Allegory. An allegory, alle means that which is something else, and agorain means to speak openly. So already the very project of allegory is connected with myth to theory to bring out in the open that which is hidden. Okay? And so if you think about what is hidden, we come now to some of the issues we're dealing with here. Because already, when we're talking about liberation, especially if you're in the context of South Africa, but if you talk about the contemporary world, you already know what we're talking about liberation from. We're talking about the degradation of human beings. We're talking about racism, sexism, etc. And the problem when we talk about these issues is that we often face them in a form of neurotic circumstance. To put it bluntly, the presupposition is that if you're going to talk about racism, sexism, and any form of degradation of human beings, you are placed in the neurotic situation as having to treat what you're doing as if it's an illegitimate practice. So that's one of the reasons you need allegory. Because you see, it is something, by virtue of talking about something else, that you bring out. So if I go to the modern, a lot of people talk about the modern, but they rarely ever define it. Just raise your hands in this room. I'm just curious. How many of you have actually heard a definition of the modern? I saw one hand go up. Okay? Well, two. Now it's striking, isn't it? But people talk about modern all the time. They talk about modernization, modernity, modern. They talk about it all the time, but they never define it. Well, here's what the modern means. All the modern means is for you to be present. It means that whatever you are is connected to the future. You got it? And if it's connected to the future, that means in a nutshell that you are where humanity is going. That's all it means. And if you think about a lot of people, particularly in ancient times, they had no reason to believe that they were not heading into the future. And so although in the past there was colonization, there was conquest, there were all those things, what went down was not the idea that certain people didn't belong to the future. The idea was that there were certain practices that were the direction people are going in. You see? But so that means that every society that sees itself as having a future is modern. Because that's the only way in which your present could be understood as legitimate. But what shifted in the 15th century, what was inaugurated in what today we talk about when we say the modern, is the idea that only certain people from Europe, and not just people from Europe, because remember I just told you, Europe was multiracial. So within Europe, only some of the people from Europe legitimately belong to the future. And with that presumption, that meant that their present was more legitimate than the others around them, which means their past is a story to that present, to the future. But for people who don't belong in the future, that means that even their present is illegitimate. And that means they belong to the past, and you know what the word is for people who only belong to the past? Primitive. Yeah. So that's where the construction of the primitive began. And not only that, you had to develop other terms to make people primitive, like tribe. You know, there were no tribes in Africa. And not only tribes, there were a lot of things that were not in Africa that many of you don't know about. There weren't kings and queens. Tribe from tribos means three, from the system of clans through which you organize groups together in Rome. And it's connected to the word tribute. It's those to whom you give tribute. No tribe. But once you've linked it to the past, then you say in tribe that there are people who don't legitimately belong to the present. So all of you all are walking around, if you say my tribe, what you're really saying is you're a ghost. Because you're haunting the present, because you don't belong to the future. So this brings us to something crucial. A lot of people today talk about capitalism, and they talk about racism, and they talk about class, and they just simply throw it out, but they don't talk about how they're linked. And so we get into rather stupid discussions. Is it race or is it class? Is it class or is it gender? Is it race or is it gender? But what we fail to understand is that the historical forces that began to produce what we're dealing with today brought a lot of baggage with them. And I'm going to give you an example. In the past, there were many markets. And markets were very human institutions. It's where people met, they trade, they talk. Sometimes they don't even trade at all. They just talk about news. But when the kind of modern I'm talking about emerged, markets began to become subordinated to the concept of the market. The market. And the market is an abstraction. The market as an abstraction is that which must not have anything out of its reach. So you know that everything I talked about before? The market must ultimately colonize and control everything. And once we begin to understand that, we have in the market a theodicy of the market. And for those of you who don't know what theodicy is theodicy involves is the construction of how you maintain the integrity of a God. Okay? You all may have had theodician arguments with your parents. You ever talk to your parents and say, how in the world could God exist with so much evil in the world? You ever had that conversation? And what does your parents say to you? Well, there are two classic responses. First one is, who the hell are you to question God? Am I correct? Translated, ultimately God is good. There's something wrong with you. Response number two, God gave people free will. People screwed it up. Translated, God's cool. Something's wrong with you. But within that framework, if we take God out and we make the market God, then if you say, if the market's so good, why am I poor? Well, there's something wrong with you. If the market is so good, why is it that I'm suffering? Why don't I have health care? Why don't I have good education? Something's wrong with you. And in fact, this everything mentality of the market requires an anthropology. And what's unique about this conception of the market is it created a category of people in whom there is the presupposition that they must have everything. I was on a committee for a thesis recently, and the thesis was wonderful, but it had a very interesting chapter. It was entitled, "What Do White People Want?" And the author went to great length to explain poetically in all kinds of ways, what do white people want? Now, the first thing you have to know is that white people didn't always exist. There was no reason before certain historical circumstances for a group of people to call themselves white. They call themselves many things. It could be Gaelic, Basque, they could be Franks, whatever. But something happened to make them call themselves white. And here's the thing that was funny. Well, you may not find it funny. But after he went through this, I said to him, you know, a lot of theorists all around the world, a lot of black radical theorists, a lot of Native American theorists, and also theorists who are members of the group white, but they understand this when they don't think, they understand that on their everyday life, they don't think of themselves as white. But when they do think of themselves as white, they have the same answer. And you know what the answer is? What do white people want as white? And the answer is everything. Everything. In fact, if you look at the ontology of whiteness, it's not the right to possess, not only the right to possess everything, but it even takes on metaphysical levels of even to possess the lack of possession of everything. That's why you can't go and say, well, look how we're suffering. Because even suffering cannot be legitimate unless it is white. Okay? Now this is very important Because you see, you notice at this moment, when I say white, I'm not talking about literally a morphological color. You see what I'm getting at? Once you link that to capitalism a certain way, that you're the proper heir of capitalism, then you can make anybody white. And once it's there, their whiteness is a function of what they should have that others should not. So if you think about what it is to think about yourself as not white, if you think about yourself as not white, you're like, man, if I could just have good health care. Boy, if the police could just stop harassing me. Boy, if I could just walk through the world with some peace of mind. In other words, non-whiteness, delinked, because non-whiteness is now that which is not a function, right, of possession in capitalism, becomes simply the idea that you should have something. You see the difference? Now, why this is crucial is that, you see, when we talk about race and racism, we often leap too quickly into caricatures without dealing with the relationships that people have to the very systems around us. And among them is a failure to understand that capitalism and racism are human systems. You see what I'm getting at? When we make it into the abstraction, the market, or we deal with the abstraction, whites, we have literally taken out the human in those relationships. Any of you all ever seen a race walking? Have you seen a gender walking? How about a sexual orientation? How about a class? I love the way you said, what? You see what I'm getting at? These are abstractions that put us outside of relationships that connect how these things are produced. And so the more we take them out, it's very easy to talk about race as if race can exist by itself. Yet race is symbiotically linked to gender, to class, to orientation, and much more. And once we begin to understand those links, we begin now to ask the question about how we talk about concepts such as liberation. I was earlier brought up the concept of shifting the geography of reason. Some of the things I said when I talked about Europe and I talked about the idea of whiteness with theory is premised, those things are premised on the idea that thinking must be European, and it puts a geography onto it. But if you shift the geography of reason, you find out that everybody thinks. And once you shift that geography and you begin to think differently, you begin to take on different types of questions. Okay? And among them is that we begin now to question the very anthropology on which we base our thought. So I'm going to offer to you some reflections that I hope will be useful. The first one is Euromodernity is what you should say if you're talking about what I just talked about. But it doesn't follow that Euromodernity is the only modernity. And this has been one of the issues that's faced not only here, but in a lot of what is called post-colonies. The presumption is that simply if you change the players, will it be sufficient, but it's possible that you maintain the game. So you have to ask, what are these games? Well, among them, some of you have already been talking about. For instance, in the post-apartheid moment or in many post-colonial moments on this continent, what has happened is that at the moment, this is what Frantz Fanon pointed out, at the moment of independence, people begin to enter creative ways of relating to the world. Okay? They change their arts, they change their foods, etc. But they keep certain mechanisms of colonialism intact. The education systems stay the way they were. The political systems stay the way they were. The economic systems stay the way they were. The religious systems stay the way they were. And one of the reasons the education systems stay the way they were is because the education systems imagined they were independent of the practices of colonial production. if you're independent of the practices of colonial production, then what should you do in the post-colonial moment? And the answer is, stay the same. So if you're going to address that issue, you're going to have to take on a very different set of resources. And now I'm going to close with 3 critical questions about addressing that. The first one is that a lot of people are using the word decoloniality and decolonization. But I got to be frank with you. I think decoloniality needs to be decolonized. Because, what has been happening, first of all, a lot of the references and stuff I hear look in its grammatical form to me to be identical to the old epistemological, missiological stuff of missionaries. A lot of y'all have just replaced one set of missionaries for another. And what do I mean? Well, I bet most of you all don't even realize, and maybe some of you do, so I don't want to be pejorative, but maybe many of you realize that actually the origins of a lot of the ideas around decolonization actually started not only on this continent, but across the African diaspora and varieties of indigenous groups. But the brand that's been brought here has been a brand mediated by African thought, particularly dependency theory, through Latin America, and then sold back to you as decolonization. And this taps into something that's already in your subconscious, because although deep down you're trying to look for something that is brought from the global south, there's still this part of how some people look for liberation, in which they're just looking for the better whites. Do you see what I'm getting at? And it's not to say that these people are necessarily nefarious, but here's the thing that you have to bear in mind. The kind of decoloniality that you've been handed has 2 fundamental fallacies. The first one is that it emerged out of a desire for an ethics. And here's the problem with that. Everything I've talked about was a function of political mechanisms and power. You can talk about ethics and morality when you are on equal footing. But unless you change those material conditions, which is what Frantz Fanon argued, and Amilcar Cabral, and many others on this continent, you could find those arguments in Anna Julia Cooper in North America. You could find these arguments all the way through, even to people such as Kugana. And the fundamental thing is, you can talk ethics and morality if you are on equal playing field. The second problem is that if you fail to deal with the mechanisms of power, then ethics collapses into moralism. And the problem with moralism is very straightforward. Moralism becomes a search for a purity. Have you noticed that people are so obsessed with being decolonized that it's almost as if you are cleansing yourself? But if you're cleansing yourself, what you're doing is making yourself into the problem. The fact of the matter is that if certain issues are political issues, then we need to dissect what's the difference between moral responsibility and political responsibility, okay? And so once we begin to understand this, we understand the last part. Because once you get in this cleansing thing, Boaventura de Souza is an example who's critical of this. The problem with the decoloniality of being and ethics arguments is that they ontologize colonialism. They, in effect, present a circumstance in which there is nowhere outside of it. And so what happens if you cannot go outward, what do? You turn inward. And that's why there's such an obsession with fixing yourselves. And I gotta say, what the hell are you fixing yourself for when so much crap has been done to you? The fact of the matter is you need to address the system. And when you say the system, you have to remember that the system is not ontological. It's not a being floating out there. The system is a set of human-produced power relations. And that means that you are in a struggle with other human beings. And this misunderstanding is often done through a misreading of a very important figure, and that is Frantz Fanon. Because a lot of people look at Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass, but they don't realize that Black Skin, White Mass was written as a critique of psychotherapy. It was a critique of the human sciences and what Fanon was expected to do as a psychiatrist. If you look at it, in fact, Fanon says outright that this is a book about narcissism. And he was right. You know why? Well, think about it. You're Fanon the therapist. What in the world takes you to a therapist? You go to a therapist because you say there's something wrong with me. And when you beat the therapist, at that moment, it's all about you. The therapeutic moment, the clinical moment, is a narcissistic moment legitimately. But what Fanon observed was that there were two kinds of people who would come to him. There would be the person who's genuinely mentally ill. But then there's the person who would come to him who is angry, who's unhappy, who's suffering. And when Fanon says, what is making you unhappy? What's making you angry? What's making you suffering? And if the answer is racism, sexism, exploitation, Fanon's response is, you are angry because you are mentally healthy. I was in Kailicha, where there was a brother who was an older comrade, who was, let's face it, the world is so bad these days, we've got to start saying comrade, man, okay? A comrade who was looking at me because he's been fed all of this social death, ontological stuff, the black is nothing stuff, and he's beating his chest, and he said, I'm not a human being, look how they treat me, I'm not a human being. And I said, my brother, if you were a human being, you wouldn't be angry. And that was Fanon's point in Black Skin, White Mass. But in Le Damné de la Terre, the damned of the earth, he had a different message. Because you see, in the damned of the earth, what Fanon noticed is that when we fail to see the human elements behind human institutions, that's when we're trapped. See, what colonialism tries to do is to make you think of contraries. But you know what contraries are? Contraries are two opposed universals. When Drusilla Cornell read the quote from Manichaeanism, Manichaeanism says there's the absolute positive and absolute negative. Both are universals. The problem with the absolute positive and the absolute negative is that those are not human worlds. The human world is a world of communication and interaction. And so the moment the human being is involved, there is a contradiction, and it is dialectical. But the error people make when they think about the dialectical is they think dialectics is about this stupid formulation that dominates thought of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But that's not the way the human world is. When you find out that the two universals are false, there are many directions in which you could go. And so the moment things are dialectical, the possibilities are many. And that's why the error that was made in European thought was to say revolution could only come through a specific class of people. And in fact, that's one of the great political fictions. I'll give you two political fictions. Political fiction number one, there's a group of people out there, somewhere, who got everything right. Now, if that is true, all you got to do is find out who they are and imitate them. Yes? Can I come in? Sure. Of course, come in. We got everything right. Okay? And of course, people go searching for these people, whether they're women, whether they're gay, whether they're trans, whether they're black, whether they're brown, whether they're indigenous. And when we make people into people who have everything right, you know what we've done? We have evacuated their humanity. What human beings are creatures who are trying to do things right. And we try to learn from each other how to do things better. The second political myth, there are many, but the second political, not myth, because I like myths. The second fallacy is that you can get everything done if you get a big enough crowd. People are obsessed with crowds. Yet a lot of human history was actually changed without there being a crowd. Because if you get a crowd big enough, it's very difficult to say, what are we going to do? You have a mass, but you don't have action. And so once we begin to dispel these, I'm going to close with an allegory, but an allegory premised upon something historical. You see, right now it's 2018. And as we thought about it, when we're talking about liberations, we're talking about not only 2018, but 2018 exemplifies, as you know, people are celebrating 1968. And if you could celebrate 1968, then you go 100 years, people are talking about Mandela's birth. Okay? We're talking about all kinds of things. But if we go 200 years, you know, 200 years ago, there are many significant things, but three things you could think about. One of them was a young woman by the name of Mary Shelley, wrote a book called Frankenstein. And many of you may not know that Frankenstein was an anti-colonial allegory. Because Frankenstein was about the problems that happen when you try to make people into your image. And of course, the image that came back was quite ugly. And ultimately, in Frankenstein, there was something that was not understood that later on Frantz Fanon and others understood. But 200 years ago was also Karl Marx. Good old Karl. No, we don't have to diss Karl. He has his problems. But you know, y'all didn't even know that Karl Marx's son-in-law was black, did you? And then he used to argue with him a lot, Lafargue. There are all kinds of things about Marx that some of you all know. He got his problems, but you know, good old Karl, you know. But there was also a third person. There are many others, but I want to bring up one person in particular. Frederick Douglass. Now we're talking. Frederick Douglass. Now, why do I bring up Frederick Douglass? Well, Frederick Douglass is connected to Frankenstein and to Frantz Fanon and to every one of you in this room in a very profound and unusual way. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Bailey. He was born in a plantation in Maryland. And you all know what they do in plantations when children are born. Well, children are born to enslaved women. Okay? They set up this whole trick to say that it has to be through your mother, you know, that you're free. And then but once they did that, then they got to police white women. They got to make sure white women don't have children with black men because then you may have free children. So they got to really police the crap out of that. So you got to make sure it's, right? So his mother is black. But his father was the master. And when that child was born, he was sent to his grandmother, who had a group of other children that she was to take care of until they were ready for servitude. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was sent to another plantation. And Frederick Douglass, when he was around 6, going on 7, was then sent to the big house to work. To work. Now, when Frederick Douglass got to the plantation to be put in servitude, his mother, Harriet Bailey, who was 12 miles away, got wind of it. And you have to understand what enslavement was, and not just in the Americas, here, because there's a lot of amnesia, particularly about South Africa. You know, this was a slave colony. And that's why many people here have all these myths about, boy, if you all take a genetics test, you'll find out that a lot of people, particularly in Cape Town area, are from people brought all over the continent as slaves. But right there in Maryland, this woman had to work from sunrise till sunset. And when the sun set, what this woman did was to walk 12 miles, and it's cold there, 12 miles to see that child. Right? And when she got there, and you have to think about how perilous it was for an enslaved woman to walk through the woods. She spent time with that child. She would lie down with him. Sometimes she would find a way to bring a piece of food that she was to eat. And she did this for 6 months. And then she died. Now, when I tell this story, what many of my students reflect on, I've asked them this question. Think about the child's point of view. You see, children are unforgiving. It doesn't matter if you're a child that your mother was a slave or your father was a slave. In fact, many of you may even have, if you grew up in poverty, a deep-rooted anger to your parent because your parent wasn't able to do certain things. And so you may think if you don't have your mother around and your father is the master, you would see yourself as abandoned. Add to the story that the child is in a world in which the child is taught one thing, that you are only valuable the extent to which your master can use you. You're a commodity. You are a function of capitalism. And capitalism says you are only valued at what you can be sold for. So what goes through your mind when this woman comes and visits you? And what many of my students, and I hope some of you at first at least think, is that what goes through the mind of the child is simply, my mother loves me. A very simple thing, my mother loves me. However, your mother, what you have just learned from the things I've been saying is, a mother is an abstraction. Just like when I said race, class, and all of those things. So when you say my mother loves me, you know what you're saying? My mother brings to me a value that transcends exchange value of the market. But it gets even more, because the world you're living tells you that if your mother is a slave, she cannot be a source of value. Really think about that. That world tells you if somebody's going to love you, it's only the person with a capacity to give value who has valuable love. So that means saying my mother loves me could be looked at as a valueless love if your mother is an enslaved black woman. Now, if we stop the story there, we would have bought into the system. Because if Frederick Douglass, as a child, began to say, well, at least I'm loved, I'm better than the other slaves, he would have bought into the system. The revolutionary moment begins when Douglass learned to value being valued by that enslaved woman. In other words, it wasn't so much about her love for him. It's about his love for her. And that's an important allegory. Because you see, you live in a world in which you're constantly told that there are people around you who are not sources of value. Since I've been coming to South Africa, black South Africans are imbibed with the view that black South Africans cannot be a source of value. Many black South Africans don't know what you mean to the rest of the world during the periods of struggle here. I've seen cab drivers who are shocked to find out that this country was the inspiration of the world even before 1994. Because you had people like Biko and Chris Hani, you had people like Winnie Mandela, who says that I don't know what the outcome will be, but I will stand up for the value of myself, my sisters, my brothers, and they were able to do it without the destructive force of hate. People talk about love, but they don't realize the profound capacity of love. And so when we come into this thing, this question we're dealing with, we now have a paradox. Because you see, people right now, when they talk about politics, they're not actually talking about politics, they're talking about morality. But you see, I very quickly break it down. Metaphysical responsibilities before God. Moral responsibility is how you act in relation to rules, right? It's a personal responsibility. Legal responsibility is whether you follow the law. But what is political responsibility? And there are philosophers who talk about this. There are many people who do, but I like the way Carl Jaspers and a woman by the name of Iris Young talk about these issues. Okay? What they noticed was that political responsibility is what every human being bears for each other. The thing about political responsibility is you don't get out of it by saying, I didn't vote for him. And boy, Americans are thinking about that right now with Trump. Right? But it's anywhere you go, political responsibility is what you carry by virtue of ultimately being a member of a society and the mechanisms of power your relationships develop. And political responsibility is always for the future. So herein is the real issue that's often overlooked. You see, moralism talks about yourself, purity and all that stuff. But political responsibility is something rather different. If you go back to Frederick Douglass's mother, if you go back to the enslaved black people of the past, if you go back to think about when Biko stood up and fought, if you go back to the many instances, if we think of somebody like Sojourner Truth in the United States, I love the fact that she chose that name, Sojourner Truth, because truth is connected to that ancestral voice. If you think about all these people in history, we have an existential paradox. All the evidence around them told them that if they acted, they would fail. So we ask, how then was it possible that they acted? You see what I'm getting at? The core of political action, when the question is transformation and liberation, is not about yourself. Harriet Bailey was thinking about Frederick Douglass, right? But Frederick Douglass had to think beyond Frederick Douglass for the revolutionary moment to occur. Political commitment is about acting to be the condition of the possibility for that which is not going to be in your image, but that which through and by virtue of your action would have the right to articulate their own. We have the capacity to love non-narcissistically. Real politics is the cultivation of freedom through which you could love that and those who are not like you. And that, if we're serious about liberation, requires us letting go of these fetishes and attachments that are indebted to the reproduction of the same, and start working on communicating and developing that which would in the future we may not recognize, but would look back at us and say, thank God they acted. Thank you. I know it's been a long day if you're all the time, but if you have questions, I'm here for you. I'm here for you.
Questions?
Yes, please say your name. By the way, since I know it's late, if as many people have questions, I have the ability to process a lot of questions. So please say your name, and if others have questions, please join in. So please say your name and ask the question.
Not used to these things. My name is Nash Lakimahobane. There's a very big generational gap between the two of us. So I wouldn't be sure if I address you, would our narratives interlink or whatsoever. But as I came to this space, trying to understand liberation and decolonization, and because I had to talk about a lot of stuff, and I've just picked something, especially the very last line that you offered now about power and all of that. So, as a young person myself, how do I move from, because all of us are in a mission to say we want to decolonize, we want liberation, and all of these things. But mostly some of the stuff are mental, and how do you deal with that mentally? Because there are other factors that you can ignore, but it is hard to love and you never receive the love back because it affects you. In as much as we could use, I was talking to my friend who was here, he was using the example of Jesus that he gave love. But I asked him, if you don't get the love back, what happens? Because it affects you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. When you say Jesus, these days, because many people in their heads think of some white guy, say white Jesus. Since this real Jesus was black.
Yeah, so those things. But now, what I'm driving at is, I'm also concerned about decolonization and all of that. So, how do you do that without touching into hate? Because we speak about the economy, we speak about a lot of stuff. But when you say you want to decolonize, because we cannot ignore the fact that South Africa was colonized, and it's affecting us now, when it is us versus the system. And the system that we cannot touch, but it affects us on a daily basis. And we don't want to have this thing of going to race and going to that, but how do you then deal with that yourself? And because it's mental. Because in this country, for example, here at Verts, it's really hard to interact with some, sorry, I'm going to bring it to race, guys. It's really difficult to interact with some white people because there's always that barrier, in as much as you want to mean well, but it's difficult, You could see that when there, even when you bump into people buying coffee, there's always that a bit of tension. How then do you do that without seeking validation from, you said there are no white people, but I'll just put it for the sake of this conversation, without seeking validation and all of that. Thank you.
Is there somebody else? Yes. And over here, yeah.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I kind of asked this question earlier on. It wasn't necessarily entertained, but your presentation now brings it up again. You talked about the issue of, he says we can't see the system, but you mentioned to the fact that the system we can see, we can touch, we know who are the people in strategic positions that are actually giving power to the system, that are actually making the system move. And then what I was saying earlier on was the issue of how do we then, if you want to check, because earlier on they were talking of the issue where we see liberation movement, the people who fought for our freedom turning into the protectors of the structures of colonialism. And this is done primarily because of the use of people who are black like us occupying positions that are key. And then I mentioned the issue of how we managed to defeat apartheid in the past. We would not, in the 80s, we started not allowing a black policeman to live with us in the community. We didn't allow any black person who was enabling that system to exist amongst us. Now that particular issue we're faced with, how do we deal with that? Because we ourselves are enabling this particular system. How do we deal with these people who are enabling the system and who are actually us? Because we can see them, we can touch them, because I like to argue with the point that we can't see the system. We can see the system, we can even touch the system. Yeah, and my last point is that on the issue of ethics, and you said ethics and morality issues we can only entertain when the playing field is level. And I think that is very profound for me, because the issues of racism, sexism, and all these things, until we address issues of economic imbalances, I don't see us addressing those issues. So for me, that point was very profound, particularly relating to the issue of economic imbalances or balancing the economic participation. Because as long as some are rich and some are super poor, they will obviously feel better than others, because when you look at it, they are literally better than others. Hence, they feel like they are better than others. So before we address economic imbalances and injustices, I feel like we're going to be talking like this in this kind of places for another coming 20 years again. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
And back there.
Sure. Many thanks for your very inspiring presentation. My name is Madalitso Piri. And I have two questions, quick ones. One has to do with, from your explanation and following your readings, etc., it seems to me that because the world is fashioned in a particular way, then it can also be undone. Like the systems that actually exist, because they were put together by people who were thinking from their own point of view. So I think what I wrestle with is empirically, what does an undoing look like? Because some other people ride on the wave of the empirics. And I think that was also, it came out when you were being dismissed earlier on in your presentation. I don't want to have an ad hominem argument, but I heard those kind of things from the back, which, you know, it kind of questions that there's nothing much that we can actually offer. But whereas philosophically, what you're trying to push for is for that different alternative. So that's the first question. And the second question is just in terms of how do you see, I liked how you explained theory. I had never seen it that way. So for me, one thing is maybe to recover the mind of God. So when we recover the mind of God, what world do we imagine? Maybe just your thoughts on that. Thanks.
In the very back. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Tebiso, and I wanted to ask a question about revolutionary love. It ties in a little bit with what the first person spoke about, and I'm going to use an example of the historical figure, which is Jesus. Well, in this instance, how I'm going to explain him is the black Jesus. But when I talk about revolutionary love, I mean, you spoke about people like Chris Hani, Winnie Mandela, and I want to bring in Assata Shakur, who, in terms of engaging with a hateful side, because I love my people, because I am invested in black people, and I love them, and I love the possibility of the future that we have, should you come at me with hate, or let's take it as Chris Hani, who was a soldier, and Winnie, who was also a soldier, as if we are in the battlefield, I'm going to shoot you and I'm going to kill you, not because I necessarily hate you, but because I'm moving from a point of revolutionary love. Like, what is the place for revolutionary love that they manifest itself as combative, as violence? And we're using Black Jesus, who went into the temple and whipped out a shambok and beat people up, not because he hated them, but because how dare you gamble in the temple of the Lord? Again, an act of revolutionary love, but it was an action which is in what I see now is that when we talk about taking action, picking up arms, and fighting for this future that we see, we're not moving from a place of hate, but it is construed as hate. So I just want to, what are your thoughts on revolutionary life as combative, as violent, if you will? Yeah.
Well, first, thank you all for your questions. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay. First thing is, remember the remark, just the point about, I don't use the expression Black Jesus at all. The reason is because historically Jesus was of color. I'm not a Christian, but the thing is, I am a professor also of Jewish studies, and I know the history. And the white Jesus was a construction that erases the history and brings the idea of God coming onto you. Okay? The questions all that you have each asked, there's a questions connected to several things that I think that emerge from something that needs to be overcome. Okay? So the basis of our meeting is imagining liberations. Okay? But you see, some of you don't realize this, but there's a way of asking questions that you've been handed that affect your ability to act. Most people want to know how before they do anything. Did you notice the structure? That's called epistemology, or knowledge-centered ways of thinking. You know, most of your life, you act, and in the action you learn. If you had to know exactly what this day would be like before you got up this morning, you wouldn't have to do anything. So try to get out of that. How do we know? How do we know? The truth is you don't. The reason I told the story I did about Harriet Bailey, and even though I use the language of love, it's not the way you think of love, because most people are thinking of love in a narcissistic way. You love somebody who's like you. I brought that story up because of it's at first in a system that's based on similarity, incomprehensibility. You see, remember I kept saying, how did they act? Why did they act? The answer is from commitment. So first thing to bear in mind is that political issues are about commitment. The second thing is once you put aside the question of whether you have to know first, the second part is, dear, let me tell you something about racism that some of you may not have thought about, just may not have. Racists love when you hate them. They want you to love them or hate them. You know what racists and racism fear most? Their irrelevance. And if you construct a world in which however much a racist hates you, it has no consequence on your life, that racist is just a quack. You see, too many people are locked to the dialectics of recognition. They're running around worried about what white people think of them. They worry about those things. And I usually put it this way. I don't worry that there are immoral people in the world. I worry if they're on top of me. Get them off of me, could be on the other side of the room, I'm cool. But you see, if I'm obsessed with his recognition, although he's off of me and I could work with you to build something different, I'm not going to spend my time building something different. I'm going to be obsessed that that person who hated me is in the room. You see what I'm getting at? And by hate becomes the condition of my control. What we have to do is shift power. Now, when we talk about human institutions, at the moment, I was just trying to open up the question for us to begin to understand that we have to think differently about action. But you see, many people don't think about how power works. You know what power is? Power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. You see what I'm getting at? And that means that when we think about a lot of these moralistic exercises, we are not devoting our attention to the access to the conditions of making things happen. Who cares if a whole lot of white people hate you or like you or whatever? What you do care about is if you don't have access to be able to build schools, clean water, healthcare, transform the conditions in our lives. We don't talk about black power. And when we think about black power, the problem is we talk about it abstractly. We don't talk about what it is to begin to do political action that cultivates relationships that transform the world. And in fact, most of us, when we talk about being political, we're still trying to imagine a future that's based on the way we value things now. But you know what? South Africa didn't always exist. The United States didn't always exist. Israel didn't always exist. We could pick a whole bunch of countries that didn't always exist. And in fact, the notion of nation states didn't always exist. We're treating the organization of power in our species as if that's the way it has always been. But in fact, right now, they're exhausting themselves. It's not just about the problems here. See, sometimes we talk about our problems as if it's sui generis, as if it's only about us. But South Africa is part of the world. And you can bet what happens here affects people elsewhere, and what happens elsewhere affects people here. And once we understand that interconnectedness, we begin to realize that we are right now trying to impose upon our species 18th, 17th, and 19th century conceptions of how to organize life when we have problems that are indigenous to the 21st century. We are part of a generation right now that for the first time are not even thinking about the 22nd century. You know, if you go and find many people in 1918, they were thinking about what would 2018 be like. If you go to meet people in 1718, they were busy trying to think about what people in 1818 would be thinking about. But we live in a world where people can't even think about 5 years from now. And that is because there's been an assault on the imagination and the cultivation of a form of nihilism of political action. We live in an age of political nihilism. But you know what? What you don't know, and one of the reasons I may have spoken in a very abstract way, is because of the context. But the fact is, we could bring up people like Assata Shakur. We could bring up, it's a very complicated issue here, I have to tell you. One of the things I argue against are academics and intellectuals who try to show off their political contacts and stuff. And part of that is because what capitalism is also involved has been the commodification of politics. So you meet a lot of people who try to market themselves as political people when they don't know squat. You see, a lot of people who actually engage in political work know there are things they cannot really share in certain contexts. But I could say very briefly to you, that when you are doing work that really works, it is connected to the mechanisms of power in such a way that what you put into it, right, has outcomes beyond your expectation. Because think about it. If you look at the situation in the world that led to the transformation of this society, they didn't have the kind of capital that other groups had. They had to rely so much on a different kind of struggle that there was an effort to block you all from understanding how to link the political and the economic. Do you know there was a black jurist and philosopher? You all have heard of a white philosopher by the name of John Rawls? I'm curious. Almost everybody who does political philosophy heard of John Rawls. Did you know that his theory of justice was formulated by a black guy 50 years earlier? His name was Charles Houston. He was the dean of Howard University and the one who had organized Thurgood Marshall to knock down segregation in the United States. Charles Houston argued, he formulated the two theories of justice that John Rawls formulated, right? One was the principle of liberty, and the other one was the difference principle, how you organize advantages and disadvantages in a society. And it's very interesting when you read Charles Houston versus John Rawls. John Rawls says if the two principles around the economic conditions and the libertarian principle conflict, the libertarian principle must prevail. But John Rawls could say that because he was a white guy in a society that was only built for him. When Charles Houston wrote the same thing, when the economic principles and the libertarian principles conflict, you know what Charles Houston said? The difference principle should prevail, because what's the point of saying you're free if there's no condition, material condition for you to act on that freedom? Do you see the point? And so once we begin to say, of course, if we leave it at this level in which we don't start talking about how we creatively organize different institutions of power, of economies, etc., if we don't start using that to set the conditions for power, and when I say power, here's another problem. When we talk about power, too many people today treat power as a negative thing precisely because they think of power in capitalist, Hobbesian terms as coercive. They think of power over. But they don't think of the fact that colonialism, racism, all these isms were productions of disempowerment. So how are you going to respond to disempowerment by eschewing power? The only way you could respond to disempowerment is by cultivating a different model of power. And the different model of power has to be a form of power in which people grow, not in which people are subjugated, degraded, and humiliated. You got it? And so once we understand this thing, they're very concrete material things. I can tell you very frankly what I see that we need to be doing in the world today. We need to eliminate nation states. We need to have a world in which we have a form of global federalism in which there's no president, but there are regional councils of people. That means that you will no longer have countries with border lines in which you can have refugees, militaries, etc. That will undermine the concept of the vulnerability of labor. Simply put, if you can't work here, you go somewhere else, and you're not vulnerable because it's not illegal to go there. Within a framework of that, it means that you have mixed economies in which you try to find ways not only to produce creatively, but it means that the big issue for those who are able to acquire any bit of capital, this is capital without capitalism, it means that the big issue is how do you retain labor, not how you push it into vulnerability. In addition to that, it means also how we're going to deal with the ecological condition of our planet when we're doing these stupid treaties that can never be enforced. If you have a global situation, you don't have militaries anymore, you have a very different kind of organization of how to maintain how to live on this planet. It may mean as a planet that there are places in which we just frankly should not live. Because if we live in those places, we're cutting off our oxygen supply. Because, let's face it, the only thing that produces oxygen on this planet is plant life. And as we begin to destroy plant life, we endanger ourselves and other forms of life. Now here's the thing, people would say that's utopic, etc. But what they fail to understand is there's a whole bunch of things we do today that people used to say were utopic, but people were committed to building them. 50 years ago, not even 50, 30 years ago, there are people who would tell you that a forum like this in this country could never have existed. Not only that, on the question of race, but on gender. There was a period in which there was a world in which the dominant forces of capital said women cannot think. And to do that, they erased the fact that a lot of women were thinking and thinking quite strong. The technological resources from the algorithm of the computer, from political theory around how to construct society, from Chinese women such as Hyun-Soo, even anarchists like Lucy Parsons. You could think of internationalists like Rosa Luxemburg. You could think of individuals who could link into the Haitian Revolution and transform dialectics like Anna Julia Cooper. All of these people, now how am I able to talk about those women today? Because people who preceded me did the political work of making it irresponsible if I don't talk about those women today. You see what I'm getting at? So it is up to us. What I would say is The issue of identifying a problem is not to look for somebody else to resolve it. It's in identifying the problem that you face the responsibility of working with others to change the world. I think we're out of time. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Gordon, thank you so much for your profound presentation, and thank you everybody for attending. See you tomorrow.